Okay, so we are beginning, I would say, the last third, the last section. Well, it's a little bit more than a third, but I'll call it the third just for simplicity. The last third of the second book of the Torah, book of Exodus. So it's always good to place ourselves where we are in the story. So essentially, the book of Exodus, the second book of the Torah, basically has three themes. So we finished the first two and we're starting the third. Um, okay, so the book of Genesis talks about patriarchs and matriarchs and their families. So we're still a family. When you go to the book of Exodus, we're a people. So it's a story of our people. And essentially, the book of Exodus has three major stories. You have the story of the slavery and the Exodus. I guess that's why the book in English or in Greek is called Exodus. And after the Exodus, you have the story of the preparation for and the giving of the Torah. So you have the 10 Commandments at Sinai and a lot of the laws that follow the 10 Commandments, the details of the laws that we also discussed last week at great length. So you have the Exodus, you have the Torah. The last part of the book of Exodus, there's four portions about this, which is tremendous amount of detail, is the story of how the Jewish people were commanded and how they built a temple or portable temple or a temporary temple for God's presence in the desert. And this is a little bit surprising. It's almost the elephant in the room, is why the Torah spends so much time and so much detail about this Mishkan, what they call, Mishkan means a dwelling place in Hebrew. Mikdash is a temple, temporary temple in the desert. You have no less than four portions that discuss it. Now, in between the stories of the temple, there's also more plots. The story of the golden calf and the story of the breaking of the tablets, therefore, on the second tablets. So if you come back, not next week, but the week after, you'll get some plots. But until then, from now until the end of the book, there's no more plots. It's the laws and the intricate details about how to build this home for God. So that's placing us in the big picture. Now we could read the parsha in a nutshell, which is what we do, the parsha in short, and then we could start asking some of the questions, some of the big questions. And after we ask some of the big questions and what some of the big themes, then we could talk about some of the specific details. So that's the roadmap. That's where we are in the book. That's where we are in the story. It's challenging to connect to these parshas because unlike up to this point in the Torah, where there's a lot of plot and a lot of fascinating stories that people can relate to, this, unless you're an architect or an interior designer, it's not that interesting. I could say it's boring. Of course, once you start reading it from the deeper perspectives, from the commentary, then you start realizing that there's a lot of significance. And even the specific measures and the specific details and the specific designs, they each represent something. And it represents something that could be applied to our life. So then it becomes interesting. But you have to dig a little deeper to find the parts that are intriguing, unless, of course, you're a builder or a designer, and then you get excited about the details as well. That's not me, so I can't speak for them. Okay, so that's sort of an introduction to the introduction. Here is the parsha in a nutshell on the screen. Teruma in a nutshell. The name of the parsha is Teruma, which means to offer, to give a gift. So the name of the parsha Teruma means offering, and is found in Exodus chapter 25, verse 2. The people of Israel are called upon to contribute 13 materials: gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and red dyed wool, flax, goat hair, animal skins, wood, olive oil, spices, and gems. So you have all different kinds of categories. You have from the inanimate, meaning stones. You have from the vegetable kingdom, things that grow. You have the wood, and then you have the animal kingdom, all different types of animal wool and animal skins, etc. Okay, God says to Moses, "They shall make for me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell amidst them." On the summit of Mount Sinai, Moses is given detailed instructions on how to construct this dwelling for God, so that it could be readily dismantled, transported, and reassembled as the people journeyed in the desert. So that's a primary component, is that it's not permanent, it's temporary. In the sanctuary's inner chamber, behind an artistically woven curtain, was the ark containing the tablets of the testimony engraved with the Ten Commandments. On the ark's cover stood two winged cherubim hammered out of pure gold. What is a cherubim? We'll say it's the sort of the face, it's like an angelic being's face of children. I think that's the most simple interpretation. Maybe we'll show some pictures later or drawings. I don't want to set a picture, it's a drawing, and we'll see what they mean and more importantly, what they represent. So that's the inner chamber. In the inner chamber, all you have is the ark that contained the Ten Commandments and the covering of the ark, with its cherubim. So the ark and the coverings. Okay. In the outer chamber stood the seven-branched menorah and the table upon which the showbread was arranged. So they have a shulchan, it's a table with bread. They would place bread there. And then there's the menorah. There's another vessel, which is called the inner altar, which we're not mentioning here because it doesn't appear till next week. Okay. The sanctuary's three walls were fitted together from 48 upright wooden boards, each of which was overlaid with gold and held up by a pair of silver foundation sockets. The roof was formed of three layers of coverings, tapestries, multicolored wool and linen. That's the first. A covering made of goat hair, and a covering of ram and tachash skins. Across the front of the sanctuary was an embroidered screen held up by 5 posts. Surrounding the sanctuary and the copper-plated altar which fronted it was an enclosure of linen hangings supported by 60 wooden posts with silver hooks and trimmings and reinforced by copper stakes. So essentially, we have this tent. It's called the tent of meeting. The walls were wood, planks of wood that were aligned, and the coverings were basically wool and animal skins. And so this temple has 2 chambers, the inner chamber and the outer chamber. The inner chamber, sort of the innermost chamber, has the ark and the covering of the ark. The outer chamber has the bread and the menorah, and then there's the courtyard. So that's essentially how generally speaking, how the temple looked. And of course, the Torah gives us a tremendous amount of detail, which we can get into at least somewhat. And like I said, the whole genre of interpretation appears to explain the significance of the measurements, of the details of the vessels. What does this represent? What is it trying to tell us? What is it showing us? As I said, the Torah is very interested in this, and the Torah devotes no less than 4 portions. This week you hear about the construction of the actual temple. Next week we hear about the creating of the garments for the priests who would work in the temple. Then we have a break for a week. Then we go back how this was conveyed by Moshe to the people. And then the following week, how the people actually did it. So the Torah is interested in this, and the Torah spends a lot of time on this. And the question is, obviously, the Torah is signaling to us that this is important. The question is, what is the importance, specifically of the details? And today, especially when we don't have a temple, at least not this form of temple, how do we connect to this? What is the meaning for our life? Go ahead, Dr. Tamar, please.
You're about to really answer the question, because recently we've been talking a lot about the laws, almost as if the Torah is our constitution, as well as our Bill of Rights, as well as our directives for how we conduct our lives. And then here's this little thing that almost describes how they constructed the Capitol building and right. what the Washington Monument was made of and why they decided to build it wherever they did in Washington, D.C. And so obviously you're now going to get into why talking about how they built the Washington Monument is going to be relevant to us today in terms of the life we live.
Yes, so that's what we have to get to. And again, it's not using this as a springboard, because we're going to go back to the big ideas, but we're going to have to connect it back to the verses. In other words, the details and the specifics of the temple have to express these big ideas. So it's not like we're just using this as a springboard. Now we can talk philosophy. We'll talk philosophy, we'll talk psychology, but that has to come back to the physical structure, because the physical structure is supposed to express these ideas. So we have our work cut out for ourselves. Now we have to start. A little hesitate, because I don't know where to start from, but we have to get by that hesitation. Okay, let's start with one verse that really goes back already to the teachings of the sages in the Medrash, and basically everything else would be boils down, and everything else comes back to this one verse and the teaching upon this verse, on the teaching of the sages based on this verse. So I'm just going to open it up on the screen, Parsha text. I'm going to open it up on the screen, and then we can share the screen, and then we could start getting in. And this is sort of the segue into this conversation. But before that, okay, we have to stop before that. Okay, there's a lot to talk about. Okay, let me just give let me try to give something very general here. We talked about the three sections in the book of Exodus. You have the story of the Exodus from Egypt. You have the receiving of the Torah, and the building of the temple. These are the three themes. Now I'm asking you a question. Are these three themes three separate themes, or are they somehow related and somehow connected? So of course the answer is they have to be connected because they're in the same book. So if you want to really take a bird's eye view and say, what are we really talking about here? And how are we progressing? We have to be progressing. If we're not progressing, then what's the point? So we want to talk about freedom. You want to talk about moving from darkness to light. That's how the Medrash describes the second book of the Torah. It's the book where you move from darkness to light. So the first step, of course, is physical bondage. If you're enslaved, you cannot be free. You cannot serve God. You cannot express your free choice. You cannot express your agency. You cannot partner with God in creation. Now, the first step is physical freedom. Take you out of the house of bondage. God takes us out of Egypt. Now we're free to decide what we want to do, how we want to spend our time. So that's physical redemption. Okay. Next step, spiritual freedom. It's not enough just not to be in prison, but you have to be able to express your true core and your soul and your purpose and your inner potential. That's what the Torah does for us. So the giving of the Torah means it represents spiritual freedom, allowing us to express the innermost part of our soul. And we do that through learning and practicing and connecting to the Torah. So you have physical freedom, you have spiritual freedom. What's the next step? The next step is in some ways the hardest and in some ways the most important. The next step, and it's something we talk about every day because that's what Judaism is about, and certainly Judaism from the perspective of Hasidism. The next step is, could you find the freedom and find the liberation and find the enlightenment and find the spirituality even when you are invested in the physical world? In other words, could you take a physical object and make it holy? And in some ways, that's the subject of everything we're going to talk about. Gold, silver, copper, wool, olive oil, precious stones, whatever it is, doesn't really matter. A list of 13 or 15 ingredients, but these are physical objects. And if you told somebody, let's make a home for God, let's study Talmud, let's make a home for God, okay, that makes sense. Let's pray, okay, that makes sense. But what are we saying here? We're saying, how do you make a home from God? We'll gather some gold, some silver, we're going to make a structure. Physical structure can house God. That's, in some ways, that's absurd. And but Judaism is embracing that absurdity. Judaism is saying, if you take the physical objects of this world and you use them for a higher purpose, you are bringing God into that space, into the physical. And in some ways, that's the greatest liberation. That's the greatest freedom. Because after you took yourself out of, or God took you out of prison, after God gives you a spiritual calling, now the third part of the book is in some ways the most important. Could you be liberated? Could you connect to that spiritual calling when you are involved and you're working with the physical material? And the answer is yes. And the answer is so important that we spend 4 portions on this, right? Because the whole idea is that to be spiritual, you don't have to leave the physical. In fact, you have to use the physical for a higher purpose. And that's sort of the overarching idea, and that's how it fits into the theme of the third book, because the third book would be physical, spiritual. If you want a formula, the second book of the Torah would be, the 3 parts would be physical freedom, spiritual freedom, and liberating, being liberated even when we are invested in materialism. So in other words, liberating ourselves from the negative aspects of materialism by being spiritually free when we are invested in the material. And that's essentially what this third book is talking about. Now, I was thinking about this recently, yesterday, really, because we talked about this in the beginning of the book. So this is, I'm just saying, I'm just saying because I'm thinking about it, doesn't mean it's true. So you have the, we talked about this when we talked about the second portion in this book. We talked about the 4 cups of wine, and we said the 4 cups of wine. If you think about it, the first 3 are talking about Exodus from Egypt, and the 4th one alludes to the verse that says God will take us to Him as a people. So that's the giving of the Torah. So in some ways, 4 cups of wine that we celebrate on Passover, the first 3 is physical freedom. 4th one is spiritual freedom. But then we know there's also the fifth cup of the cup of Elijah that we don't drink, but we fill it up. It's sort of in between. What is that? So I was just thinking to myself that the 5th cup, the cup of Elijah, alludes to the 5th expression of redemption in those verses where it says God will bring us to the land of Israel, right? So just to summarize, you have 3 verses that talk about Exodus from Egypt. That's why we drink 3 cups of wine. 1 verse that talks about God will take us to Him as a people at Sinai. That's the 4th cup of wine, spiritual freedom. And then there's the 5th cup. And the 5th cup is God will take us into the land of Israel. Now, it's not part of the 4 cups because it's in a way, it's a separate theme. This redemption is redemption, physical redemption, spiritual redemption. That's a package. The 5th cup, okay, it's a nice thing. We'll go to Israel. But in some ways, I think that Israel represents the Mishkan, the house of God that we make in the desert. In some ways, it's the same theme. The theme is that you could be connected to God even in the physical, even when you're building an economy, farming the lands, as the Jewish people do in Israel, where it becomes a holy land. What aspect becomes holy? Not just the temple, not just the kotel, but every aspect of the land becomes holy, even the physical. So in some ways, the theme of the Mishkan is the same theme as Israel. Now, we're doing the same in our life because we're making a miniature Israel wherever we go, but that's already a broader subject. Okay, so this is a little bit about the overarching theme. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to demonstrate that for Judaism, connection to God is not just when you go to Sinai, but it's when you use the physical blessings that God gives you in a proper way and in a holy way and a purposeful way. That is where you see, that's how you make a home for God. That's how you bring God into your life. That's the big idea. Now, where does this big idea come from? Go ahead, Dr. John, please.
My question is this, as you talk, Rabbi, and you always incredibly stimulating. Would you say that exactly the same thing was done when they built Notre Dame with incredible attention to details, or every church? Because basically it took years and years and years to create that, but it wouldn't have been created if every one of these architects and builders didn't have their eye on a higher goal, which was why they were doing it in the first place.
So that's very interesting. That what is the model of a cathedral or structure for prayer? What are you trying to build? And that's very interesting because I would say that's much more like a temple in Jerusalem. Temple in Jerusalem was a grand building, and it was supposed to encourage beauty, but awe. And it's supposed to, when you walk in there, you're supposed to feel that overwhelmed by the grandeur of the experience, right? So that's one style of building. And you have some synagogues that are built in that model, in some ways trying to replicate the feeling you had when you went into the temple in Jerusalem. But what's interesting, and that temple in Jerusalem has the same essential features as this temple, except everything is on a much more grand scale. So instead of having 2 chambers, it has these 2 chambers. It has many more chambers. It's a much bigger structure, but the proportions of these 2 structures are the same. But what I'm trying to say here is, and this is my point, in some ways, this structure looks much more like a house than like a temple or like a church, much more like a house. And even the furniture, what do you have in your house? What do you need for a house? Okay, you need a bedroom, you need a place to eat, and you need some light. You need a chandelier. What do you need? That's essentially what we have here in this temple, in this structure. And what do you need? You need a 1-bedroom apartment. You need a room for your private space or the intimate space. That's the bedroom. And then you need the room where you just go about your day and you bring guests and you invite guests, etc. You're not going to invite guests to your bedroom, I hope, right? But you invite guests into your dining room. So essentially, that's what's happening in this temple. So I want to get back to this theme of home. The temple to God is a home. Looks like a home and it feels like a home. In Jerusalem, King Solomon goes crazy, makes it feel much more like a temple. But in the desert, it still feels like a home. Even Jerusalem is like a home because the essential features like a home, but you didn't feel like you're going home. You feel like you're going to this unbelievable structure. And again, the feeling that it produces within you, there's different feelings that different structures are supposed to do. Even today, you have very nice shuls, and then when you have what we grew up with, you went to a shtibel. A shtibel is Yiddish for a little home, and it's more cozy and more intimate. And which one is the right way? There's two ways to pray. We can get into that right now. We can get into that. I'll just be very brief because I'm sorry, I'm going on this tangent, but it's fun. If you look at the Talmud, Tractate Brachot, the blessings, the first tractate in the Talmud, it says there's two reasons why we pray. One reason why we pray is because if you look at the stories of Genesis, you see that Abraham prayed once in the morning, Isaac once prayed in the afternoon, and Jacob once prayed at night. So what do we see? We see there's a precedent to pray in the morning, in the evening, at night. So you know what? So the sages said, let's pray 3 times a day. But essentially, it's commemorating or the origin story of prayer is the patriarchs praying. Okay, that's one logic of why we pray. The second interpretation in the Talmud of why we pray is very simple. There was a temple. And we're going to read in the next book, in the third book of the Torah, about the sacrifices. And there are daily offerings. And there's a daily offering every morning. And there's a daily offering every afternoon. And then there's extra parts of the service. If it spills over, they need more time, they could conclude the services at night. So that's a third time. So therefore we have two, that's the origin story, is we pray to commemorate the service of the temple because we have no temple anymore. Okay, one way to think about it is it's not just a question of where did prayer start from? It's what form of prayer are we taking? And what form are we taking, or prayer are we taking? And in some ways, the temple you sign up, the temple you subscribe to, in other words, the actual structure you build is going to reflect one of these two models. Either prayer is to commemorate the prayer of the patriarchs, meaning it's a personal, cozy, and homey and intimate connection between you and God. Like Abraham. Abraham prayed alone. He didn't pray in a prayer in a temple. Or prayer is supposed to resemble the offerings in the temple, and Solomon, and the Temple of Solomon was a great building. When you came there, the opening was the door was 100 feet, 100 amma, could be even 200 feet. When you come into a door that's 200 feet tall, it's designed to make you feel small. That's a completely different feeling than when you come to a small little shtibel, a small little home to pray. That's more like the intimate prayer. My point is, even the structure of the synagogue is they're going to depend on these two features. Because on one hand, you want to feel how God is grand and we're small and we're humble before God. That's one element. On the other hand, you want to feel the intimacy and the closeness. Which one is true? They're both true. So I want to say, temple in Jerusalem is much more like a cathedral. The temple that we're describing now is much closer to a home. It's a homey feeling. It's a different feel. And maybe we'll elaborate upon it either later today or next week or the week or 2 weeks and 3 weeks. In other words, there's a lot more to think about when you talk about this. Okay, go ahead, Benjamin and Nicole. Thank you.
So I recently realized that Sinai, where Sinai is a mystery a little bit. That it might be in the desert, it may be in Saudi Arabia, that we really don't know. And I was trying to, as I listened to you talk now about coming down, making a home on, of a temple or a tabernacle or a temporary structure, how that kind of idea that, where that the mystery of where Sinai is sort of lost, that we didn't end up seeing everyone go up to Sinai and get the revelation, but the revelation and the life has to take that place on this earth,
right,
so to speak, and in that world, and we shouldn't be hanging in on the idea of going up into the clouds, but really down on earth with a temple and with these temporary structures. So, and that's just kind of a general observation, and on maybe your thoughts on it, I guess.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much. Let me just address that very, very quickly. And I want to contrast Sinai to the Temple Mountain in Jerusalem. Temple Mountain in Jerusalem, let's start with Sinai. Sinai right away, almost built into the story of Sinai. The first thing God tells the people when they reach Sinai is God tells Moshe, make a border around Sinai. Don't let the people climb the mountain, because whoever touches the mountain is going to die, right? This is a holy place. God is showing up. Anyone touches the mountain will be harmed. But right away, built in 6 days before the revelation, the first thing that God says is, When you hear the sound of the shofar, meaning when the ceremony is over, the last blow of the shofar, anyone can climb the mountain. In other words, built into that story is the feature that Sinai is holy, but it's temporary. Contrast that to the Temple Mountain. The Temple Mountain, we believe, is holy even after the temple is destroyed. Right? The rabbis derive it from a verse in the third book of the Torah that describes the exile. That even when the temple is destroyed, the Temple Mountain is holy. Why the difference? So the one theory is, and I think it's a good theory, is that Temple Mountain is top down. God chose it, God showed up, and God made it special. I'm sorry, Sinai. Sinai is top down. Anything top down is not going to actually last because it's superimposed. If it's superimposed, it's temporary. The only way holiness could endure is if the people invest and the people build it. And that way, the holiness that's coming from above, because holiness is a partnership between God and man, but that holiness now could endure because it's also created by people. It wasn't superimposed from above. And that's why if you look at the story, the book of the prophets, King David selected the place for the temple. God says it's the place that I will choose, and therefore the prophet has to confirm. But God will choose only after you offer a good option. And we can also derive that from the verses. The bottom line is you have that participation that makes it endure. Okay, so that's about the Temple Mountain. Now the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is interesting because on one hand, as you point out, its temple, the holiness of Sinai is going to continue in the temple, and we'll talk about that hopefully if we have time, if not now, then the next week or the following, one of these weeks that we talk about the temple. So on one hand, don't try to recreate the Sinai, recreate the temple, because temple itself is the recreation of Sinai. There's no other way to do it. So we can talk about that. But on the other hand, at least in the temple that the Torah derives no less than 4 portions to, it's temporary. It's not permanent. It's not going to be in a specific place. We don't even know the exact location of any of those temples. Well, we know the first one was built at Sinai. Okay, but we're not sure where Sinai is. So here, the Hasidic commentaries say the Torah is putting in so much energy into this. Now, if you say the Torah is going to give a lot of energy to talk about the dimensions of the permanent temple, that makes sense, right? Because this permanent temple lasted for 800 years with the break. First 410, and then there was 70-year exile. Then they rebuilt it for 420 years. So a total of 830 years, the temple stood in Jerusalem in one place. Okay, that I understand that you'll spend 4 portions to give me the dimensions of the permanent structure. And also that place is permanent. But here we're giving all these dimensions and all this real estate and all this energy for something that's inherently temporary. And the Hasidic interpretation is, that's the whole point. The whole point is wherever you may go, even if it's a place that you're only temporary, it's not going to be a place that's going to be holy for 800 years. Wherever you go, you have the power to make a home for God. And that home has significance, and that's exactly where God wants to dwell. So the fact that it's temporary is exactly the feature that the Torah is really the novelty that Torah is telling you. Torah is telling you it could be anywhere. It doesn't have to be a specific, unique, holy place. It could be anywhere. And that is why we're not telling you exactly where the temple was. We know the temple was throughout the travels, but they don't know exactly where they traveled. But the point is, in this context of this story, it's a temporary temple. It's movable, it's portable. So what is a portable? Was the fact that it's portable just a product of the fact that they happened to be traveling, so they had to make it portable? It was a technicality. Or you could say, which I believe is the truth, that the true intention, that the fact that it's portable is the whole point. The whole point is you could take now the holiness wherever you go. And that's the message. So that's a little bit about that. Now we want to go back at least to that one verse that I wanted to talk about because it opens up everything. It opens up all the discussion. And let's read the actual verse and we'll see how the rabbis interpret it. So it starts, God spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelites and take a contribution for me. Tells you what to take, right? Verse 3, verse 4, verse 5. The following materials constitute the contribution that you must take from them: gold, silver, copper, turquoise, purple, scarlet, linen, and goat hair, red-dyed ram skins. You get the point? And then comes verse 8. They must make a sanctuary. Oh my God, I don't like this translation. They must make me a sanctuary. V'asuli mikdash. They will make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell in their midst. I will dwell in them. Probably more accurate. the rabbis look at verse 8 and say, what does this mean? They will make me a sanctuary. How would I write the phrase if I'm writing the Torah? I would say they will make me a sanctuary and I will dwell in it. Make a structure and I will dwell in it. But that's not what it says. It says make a structure and I will dwell in them. And the rabbis say, what is in them? The rabbis interpret it betoch kol echad ve'echad, within every individual. In other words, the purpose of this temple is not that now we have a place that God dwells, and now God is in the temple or God is in the synagogue, and I can go home and mind my own business because I have a place for God. No, the temple is a symbol how God dwells in every individual. In other words, one way to think about this is you have to look at the temple and say, what are the features of the temple? What are the ingredients of the temple and how do they apply in my life? Because the purpose is not to have a place where God rests, one place, but in every single person. That's one genre. So the Kabbalists are very into that genre. They want to look at every detail and say how the human soul and the human body really, but the body and the soul together, they are the temple. So we're the temple. Each individual is the temple. That's one way to read it. Another way to read it is what is in everyone, in their midst, but again, but in the plural. V'shachati, I will dwell in them. What is them? Them is the home of every person. Every person's home is a temple. Every Jew's home is a temple if done properly. And that's why the temple that we're commanded to build, the tangible temple that we're commanded to build, is, of course, a mitzvah. And of course, God dwells there, and we call it the tent of meeting, and that's where God spoke to Moses. But that is just a symbol of what we're supposed to recreate within our own home. And this one verse opens up everything that's going to follow to interpretation and saying, how does this apply to my home? How does this apply to my soul, to my inner life? And now when we read this verse, now the rest of the parsha becomes much more significant because it's not about how they built the temple in the past, which by the way, they never built again. Because once they went to Israel, once they went to Jerusalem, the dimensions changed. I said dimensions didn't change. I made a mistake. I meant proportions. The proportions are pretty much the same, at least for these two buildings, but dimensions change, everything changes. So why is this so important? But if it's my soul and my home, okay, so now that becomes significant and that becomes important. So that's a little bit introduction. I keep saying introduction, I keep adding introductions, but I think we're still introduction in the sense that we're still big picture, and we still didn't get specific into the details. Again, you could start looking at the way the Torah analyzes every vessel, and maybe we should do that. I think we'll do that. I still want to reserve 5 minutes at the end, so please somebody remind me at 12:55, or I'll try to remember myself. Just go back in a little bit and say more big picture. But before you get to big picture, let's start thinking about what the Torah introduces and how the Torah introduces it, and then we could start thinking about the meaning, and then we could again extrapolate backward back to our soul and back to our home. But again, the big picture. Why is this important? This is important to tell us that the connection to God in Judaism is not necessarily the synagogue. It's every individual and every home. The synagogue or the temple in Jerusalem was just the symbol for what we're supposed to recreate. Now, of course, the symbols are important, and there's a mitzvah to build the temple. But the question is, what is the significance? Not just that I should have a place to go serve God. No, place that I should go serve God and remind myself that my home is also a place to serve God. My home is also a place where God dwells. And that's why the temple, what does a temple look like? Like I said, a temple looks like a one-bedroom apartment. Now, God should build a mansion. Okay, we'll go to Israel, we'll build a mansion. You don't really need a mansion to live. You could live in a one-bedroom apartment. That's where God lives. Even in a one-bedroom apartment, you can bring God into your life. If you have a big mansion, it's much harder because you have to fill every aspect of the home with meaning. That's very difficult. You have to be very spiritually aware to be able to have a mansion and fill every room with holiness. But either way, the point is it could be done anywhere, and that's part of the message. Give me just a moment. I want to find the best way to do this. Okay, this is a better translation that I like better, also on Chabad.org, but it's the better one, I think. So here we go. The first thing we say right after the Mikdash, right after the sanctuary, the first thing we say, what do we build? By the way, this is very strange. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. How do you build your home? How do you design your home? Most people, they're going to first design the home and then and then buy furniture, right? Most people don't walk down this Greenwich Avenue and say, you know, I see a beautiful couch. You know what? I'm going to buy this couch. You know what? Now I have to design a room to fit this couch. Oh, I don't have room, so I need a house to put the room in. So I'll design a house, right? That's most people. Maybe most people will not do that. Maybe some people will, I don't know. But most people, you first build a home and then you fill the furniture to serve the home. But not here. Here we're saying, what is the purpose? What is the purpose? The purpose is the furniture. The home serves the furniture. We could talk about that dynamic of which one was commanded first and which one was built. So we'll get it. We can talk about that another time. I just want to point out that here, the first thing we hear about is the ark. What is the ark? That housed the Torah, houses the Ten Commandments. And in a way, that's Benjamin's point earlier, that in a way, what we're talking about is you just came from Sinai. Sinai is where God gave you the revelation. God gave you his will. How do you maintain that connection to God? So you could say, go to the wilderness and find Sinai. If you can't find it, keep looking. Go away from civilization, go to the wilderness and try to divest yourself from the concerns and the distractions of daily life. And that's where maybe you'll be open to hear the revelation. We say, no, the way you find God is in the Torah. So you have to build a house for the Torah. Now, what that would basically mean is that in your life, dedicating time to study Torah is the building of the ark. We can also talk about in the physical home what the bedroom is. Well, but you have to give me a few minutes before I get to that. Okay, so let's read verse 10. The first thing we hear about, you shall make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits its length, 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. We have what to talk about the dimensions, but again, not right now. We first want to say big ideas. And you shall overlay it with pure gold from inside and from outside. You shall overlay it, and you shall make upon it a golden crown all around. So in other words, what are you doing here? You have a wood box. There is surrounded with gold from the inside and on the outside. And then you shall cast your 4 golden rings for it, and you shall place them upon its 4 corners, 2 rings on its one side, 2 rings on the other side, and you shall make poles of acacia wood, and you shall overlay them with gold, and you shall bring the poles into the rings of the side of the ark to carry the ark with them. Okay, so basically you have the ark, now you have to have rings to hold up the poles, and you have to have poles in the ark, and this is very important. God forbid, the poles of the ark shall be in the rings, they shall not be removed from it. So it's very interesting. The ark, built into the ark, is not built in, but it's separate, but it has to remain in the ark. The poles that carry the ark must remain in the ark. We could talk about that as well, but let's keep going. What happens after that? Okay, and you shall place into the ark the testimony which I will give you. What's the testimony? Testimony is the 10 Commandments. Okay, now we need a covering for the ark. And you shall make an ark cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits its length, 1.5 cubits its width, and you shall make 2 golden cherubim. You shall make them of hammered work from the 2 ends of the ark cover. Make 1 cherub from the one end and the other cherub from the other end. From the ark cover you shall make the cherubim on its 2 ends. The cherubim shall have their wings spread upward, shielding the ark cover with their wings, with their faces toward one another. Toward the ark cover shall the faces of the cherubim shall be the faces of the cherubim. And finally, verse 21 and 22, beautiful verses. And you shall place the ark cover on the ark from above, and into the ark you shall place the testimony which I will give you. Verse 22, I will arrange my meetings with you there, and I will speak with you from the top of the ark cover, from between the 2 cherubim that are upon the ark of the testimony, and that I will command all that I will command you unto the children of Israel. Now let's go and find some pictures because there's a lot of details here. So it's always good to look at a picture. Let's find a nice picture of this. Okay, what do we want? Parsha. We'll go to Parsha, current Parsha. We'll go to, I think the best pictures are in the Kahat Chumash, I think. And then we'll download the PDF, why not? No, no pictures, picture time, no pictures. The ark, okay, let's see if we have some pictures here. Okay, so this is the ark itself. He's basically showing the dimensions. There was basically, it was really three arks. There was three boxes. There was a box of gold, of wood, and then they put that inside. There was a box of gold, and then a box of wood, and then a box of gold. So there are three boxes, and then it becomes, that's how you get a box of gold, which has a box of wood that has gold on the inside and the outside. You want the covering. These are the dimensions. Okay, we're not going to get into that right now. That's the actual temple. And I think there's a picture here. Okay, so these are the poles. So you have the ark, and now you have four rings, and you have the poles. The poles must remain in the ark. And then you have the cover of the ark, which we call kaporet, and the covering of the ark with the cherubim looks something like this. So this is the final product. You'll have the three arks, the wood surrounded with gold on the outside, gold on the inside. Then you have all this is pure gold. Very interesting. Pure gold. The cherubim and the cover are pure gold. And it's supposed to be cherubim is like, it's not exactly clear, but let's assume it's children. And they have wings because it says they cover. And God speaks to Moses from between the cherubim, from between the coverings of the ark. In other words, up till that point, they heard the command, they heard the Torah at Sinai. From here on, Moshe would hear the revelation as if coming from between the cherubim. So this is the ark. This is the first thing we have to know. Now let's think. We want to think about what does the ark represent? What do the cherubim represent? The cherubim are much more mysterious because the ark we understand. The ark houses the Torah. Cherubim, what do they represent? So God will come and dwell between the cherubim. What does the cherubim represent? And even we can get a little technical and talk about the question, and it's up for debate between the early commentators, are the cherubim, is the cover on the ark, is it one vessel or is it two vessels? Is it one theme or is it two themes? And there's a lot at stake here. So we have to start unpacking. But this is, so let's talk about these two vessels and what they represent. So the first thing you think about when you talk about the two cherubim is that the cherubim, what do they look like? They're children, but the rabbis say they're male and female. In other words, it's not exactly the same. How they know that? It's a little bit of Hebrew grammar. If you say shnei cheruvim, if you know a little Hebrew, modern Hebrew, you say shnei cheruvim. Shnei cheruvim means two cheruvim. But in biblical Hebrew, you use the term shnei when they're exactly the same. The Torah doesn't say shnei cheruvim. The Torah says shnayim cheruvim. Not shnei, but shnayim. Shnayim is more formal Hebrew. Is more formal in this context. And it's plural, meaning shnei is plural, but shnayim is an extra plural, emphasis on plural. And here, when you say shnayim, you mean there are two and they're not exactly the same. Oh, in what way are they different? Torah doesn't say. Okay, so the rabbis say one's male and one's female. What are we saying? We're saying that there's a certain intimacy that the cherubim represents. The cherubim represent intimacy. Now the question is, what does intimacy have to do with the Torah? So, and it all ties into the idea that if the temple is a home, then the outer chamber is where you eat. You have a table and you have a menorah, which is light, and you also have incense, which is good smell, but the incense is next parsha. Then the inner chamber is the bedroom. Bedroom is a place of intimacy. Where is the intimacy? Where is the Jew intimate with God? And it's clear what the Mishkan is telling us, what Torah is telling us, the place of intimacy is the place of the Torah. When you study the Torah and you unite with God's will and wisdom, you understand God's innermost thoughts. That's where the intimacy happens. So study of the Torah is the place where the soul and the soul has this intimate bond with God that originated and started at Sinai, but is continued throughout history, throughout the Mishkan, which is the house we build to house the intimacy for God, which is essentially the Torah study. So that's one layer. Now we want to think about more specifically. So that's one thing. That's the Ramban, Nachmanides. Nachmanides is big into the idea of the centrality of the Torah to the theme of the Mishkan, but other people disagree a little bit. We can get into the details. But the first interpretation is this. The first interpretation is that the ark represents the Torah, and the covering of the ark, which is, you could say, just beautiful. What is it doing? What function? Everything in the Torah, everything in the the intimacy of God when you study the Torah. So that's one way. That's one way of thinking about it. More specifically, there are other other commentators, Rashi amongst them, and the Hasidic interpretation also adapts this view. It's really two separate themes. And in a way, let's just to start with this for a second, you want to think about the ark as the Torah. Then there's something above the ark. In other words, to read it this way, you have to classify the covering not as a covering of the ark, but as a separate vessel. So the Torah doesn't state clearly. The Torah doesn't define the ark. We call it a covering, but Torah doesn't refer to it as covering. Torah just says kaporet. We don't know what that is. Maybe we'll find that in a few minutes. We don't know what the covering is. So defining it as a covering is already taking a stand in the debate of what is this function. So let's assume for the purpose of discussion that opinion number one said it's a covering. Opinion number two says it's not a covering. It's a separate thing. Now, if it's a separate thing, how is it on top of the ark? What is higher? What is elevated? What is above the Torah? Wouldn't the Torah be the highest thing? Right? So according to the first interpretation, it makes sense. The Torah is the place of intimacy. The cover represents, the cover is serving the ark. It's part of the ark. It's the same thing. There's nothing above the ark. But another interpretation is no, the cover is a separate theme because the Torah refers to the ark as the ark before the cover is made. So the cover is a separate theme. So what does the cover represent? So here you have the idea where on one hand you talk about male and female, which is intimacy, but on the other hand you also talk about the keruvim. Keruvim, according to some interpretations, means children. So in short, what we want to say is like this: the keruvim represent the unconditional bond between God and the people, and it's unconditional in two senses. First of all, it's children. So love to children is unconditional. Love to older children, even though at the core it's unconditional, but at some point you love them because of who they are, what they achieved, etc. It's not only unconditional, it's not always unconditional. If you always show unconditional love to your children, that's probably not helpful for them. As a child, you have to always show unconditional love. As an adult, as they get older, there's other factors. The relationship becomes more complex, and that's the way it should be. But so the children represents the unconditional love. And more important, the word kaporet. What does kaporet mean? Kaporet comes from the word kapara, which is atonement. Now, Torah is a book of laws, amongst other things, but a lot of laws there, 613 laws. So it's a lot of laws. So you may make the mistake and say that our connection to God is dependent on those laws. If that's the center of our relationship, then if you follow the laws, okay. And if you make a mistake and you transgress the law, then you're out to lunch. You're out of the relationship. So the Torah is saying, one second, that's not correct, is the concept of atonement, is the concept of forgiveness. Where does forgiveness emerge from? Where does forgiveness come from? Forgiveness is deeper than the Torah. Forgiveness says, even if you did not listen to the Torah, there's a love that's more profound than the love that comes because you follow the Torah. And that love is the unconditional bond between a Jew and God, right? So your children come home and you have rules and you say you have to make your bed in the morning and you have to clean up after yourself, and whatever the case is, there's a bunch of rules. And if you don't follow the rules, don't come home, right? So that's the rules. But is that the essential connection? No, if you go deeper and a child violates the rule, there could still be forgiveness. Where does the forgiveness come from? Because there's something deeper than the rule. Even though the rule represents who you are, represents your logic and your will, and it's a very intimate part of yourself. Your rules reflect who you are and how you want to live and how you want your environment to be. And in some ways, your will is the deepest part of you. But there's something even deeper. And the deeper part is the unconditional bond. And the unconditional bond is the kaporet, is the covering. So that's the debate, whether or not, what does the keruvim represent? Either the intimacy that comes through study of Torah, or the intimacy and the unconditionality of the bond that even runs deeper than the Torah. And that's where forgiveness emerges from. But either way, if you want to talk about the temple as a home, it's the place of intimacy. And the place of intimacy is where the deepest part of the most deepest part of self connects to the deepest part of the other person. So that's a little bit about the ark. We have 5 minutes left, so I want to just try to do. Okay, go ahead, Benjamin. Go ahead.
I had a note to say 12:55, so it's 12:50.
Thank you. I have 5 minutes left, so I want to do one more general thing, which I have not mentioned in the past, I don't think. I always try to say something new that I never said. So we'll try to do this, and if anyone wants to stay after for some questions, is good. But let me try to do this very quickly. So you have, let's see if there are pictures. Are there pictures? Let's continue the quest for pictures. Okay. So you had, this is the table. After the ark, we have a table. Now on the table, you have, there's also, this is the way the table looks at the end, because this is the loaves of bread. They made fancy loaves of bread, showbread, without getting into things. Basically a table with showbread. They call it showbread. Let's leave that alone for a second. This is how the bread looked. The bottom line is you have a table with bread. Then you have a menorah. Menorah is pure gold.
Yes, I've already.
Pure gold.
The old ones.
You have the pure gold, and both of those pieces of furniture, the bread and the menorah, are in the outer chamber. Okay, now let's see if they have a picture of the two chambers. Then the coverings. This is how it looked from the outside. Well, I want an inside view. Is there an inside view? This is the coverings, the various coverings. Let's see if we have an inside view. I don't want to waste too much time on this, but it's just visual is always good. This is how they built the cubits. Okay, remember, every single thing here has significance. Whatever we don't get to this today, we'll get to in the next few weeks or next year. But everything here is significant. Okay, let's keep going. Anyone, please for a nice picture at the end. Okay, just let's use this picture. You have the innermost chamber. Anything better with the cubits? What's happening here? What am I looking at? Oh. Okay. Okay, this is a bird's eye view of the temple with the courtyard. So we're going to leave the courtyard alone. I'm looking at the temple. I have the inner chamber, which is the ark. I have the outer chamber, which the outer chamber, even though it has a golden altar, but the golden altar is not discussed in this week's parsha. So we're just going to talk about the two things of this week's parsha, which would be the table and the menorah. Okay, so what does the table and the menorah represent? So in a way, if you just want to stay simple, and this is, I think the more simple you stay, the better you are. The table is bread. The table is the physical needs of man, of the human being. The menorah, any way you define the menorah is light. Light is enlightenment. Light is spirituality, right? Even in English, you would say enlightenment is a metaphor for wisdom. Light is a metaphor for wisdom. If you need an icon for an idea, you put a light bulb, right? An idea came into your head. It's a light bulb went off. So light and wisdom is and awareness is synonymous. So you have the physical needs of the human being, and you have the spiritual needs of the human being, or the spiritual life of the human being. The home that God tells us to build, and again, that's the home, which is the physical home, the tabernacle. But again, the message is for each of us. We too have those two components. In your home, you're going to have physical needs. You're going to eat lunch, and you also have your menorah. You're also going to have your library. We're going to study Torah. Now, where is God? Where do you find God? Putting the intimacy apart for a second, where do you find God? The idea is in everything, even in the physical life, even when you eat, that's going to be a holy experience, because that's part of the whole message here, is that a home for God is built of physical materials and physical activities. So if you're eating for a higher purpose, then the bread itself is where God is housed. The bread itself becomes furniture in the divine home. Okay, so these are the message. So in other words, we have both physical life and spiritual life in the outer chamber. Okay, but now comes maybe a little bit of a deeper point. In some ways, I may have to go over a minute or two. I apologize in advance. In some ways, the menorah and the table of bread, in some ways, they mirror the ark and the covering of the ark. Now, I can get specific in why that is, but let's just start with the most simple, which is the material that it's made of. The ark is wood that is plated with gold. The table is wood that is plated with gold. The menorah is pure gold. The covering of the ark is pure gold. Okay? So in other words, there's two vessels in the innermost chamber, the ark and its covering. There's two vessels in the outer chamber, the table and the menorah, and they reflect each other. Now, if you think about it, the table is physical, the menorah is spiritual. If you go into the Holy of Holies, the ark is more tangible. You have the law on stone, it's tangible. The covering is more mystical, it's intimacy, it represents the presence of God, but it's not anything tangible, it's not serving any function. So we have both physical and spiritual in the outer chamber. We have physical and spiritual in the inner chamber. So now you could think about this, and you could think about this in all different dimensions. I'm just going to give one or two. When we live our life, there's a dichotomy between physical and spiritual. We feel more connected to God when we're at the menorah than when we're eating at the table. So we have both in the service of God, but we feel that they're different. When you have intimacy with God, when you go into the inner chamber, when you feel God's experience, from God's experience, it's the same. Physical and spiritual is the same. God is no more closer to the physical or the spiritual. So the ark and the menorah, so the ark and the cherubim and the covering are one vessel, two components of one vessel. The way we experience it, it's two separate entities. There's the physical and the spiritual. To us, we may not feel the same. It's two things, both important, but it's different. But from the divine perspective, the dichotomy between physical and spiritual does not exist. So that's a very important point, because in a relationship is our perspective and God's perspective. From God's perspective, the physical doesn't obscure the presence of God. That's one thing. Now, part of that is that's why God, again, we talked about this in the past, that according to Judaism, God is present in the physical. In a sense, the true intimacy with God could be achieved specifically through a physical mitzvah. Through a physical mitzvah, you having intimacy with God. How could that be? Because the physical and the spiritual could become one from God's perspective. Now, if you want to take that to, and that's within the ark. Now, if you want to take that to even in the physical world, if you have intimacy in a holy way, the Judaism refers to the sexual act of intimacy. If it's done properly, the Torah refers to it as kedusha, as holiness. Marriage is kiddushin. Betrothal is kiddushin, same word for holiness. Here you have a very interesting idea. The deepest connection to another person, the most spiritual connection to the other person, occurs and could occur specifically through a physical act. Okay, that's very interesting, something to think about. And that really represents what's happening in the Holy of Holies, where you have the fusion of the physical and the spiritual in the service of God. And that's where the true intimacy is found. So there's a lot more to say, but it's 1:02, so we'll pay respects to the clock. We'll stop here. A lot more to talk about. Comments, questions, welcome. Otherwise, everyone have a wonderful day, and let's see each other continuing to study Torah in good health.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Wonderful.
Great lecture.